Welcome to Bluegrass Brooklyn, our podcast all about the music we love, straight from the Bluegrass borough of Brooklyn, New York.
Hello, and welcome to this Monday edition of the Bluegrass Brooklyn podcast. I'm your host, Liz Wolfe, and in these editions, we explore topics that are related to and supporting our favorite music, bluegrass. Enjoy the show. Hello and welcome to Don Flemons. He is the band leader for a band called the Traveling Wildfires. Of course, he's many, many other things than that, and one of which is he's known as the American Songster because he, in his music, celebrates over 100 years of American music. So welcome, Dom.
Thank you so much, Liz. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So 100 years, that's a lot of music.
Oh, yeah. Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this past century. If we go from where we are right now in 2026, that's going back to 1926. But I have songs that I'm performing in the shows actively that go even back to the 1890s and the 1880s. And then also being a songster, one of the ideas was to be able to broaden the way that my music is being defined beyond being just a singular performer in a singular genre. Since I play a lot of different types of songs, from whether it be folk or bluegrass or country music or blues music, I wanted to be able to define it all in a much broader term. But also the songster is actually a moniker that has been placed on musicians going all the way back to the late 19th century. So I wanted to repurpose it for the 21st century as we've been continuing moving forward.
Well, I once got to see you play in a small venue up in Westchester. This was pre-pandemic. You were solo at that particular thing. And mostly what I remember from it, other than it was an awesome concert, was the large variety of instruments you had around you, all of which were tuned in a different manner, and some of which, am I correct in saying they were handmade out of gourds and various things?
Yes. Well, when I'm performing solo, I tend to bring multiple types of stringed instruments, mostly guitars and banjos. Probably at that time I had my gourd banjo, but I've also been using a style of banjo called a tackhead banjo, which is another style of fretless banjo, which I have a special custom-made model made for me by a luthier named Jeffrey Menzies that he lives out in Jamaica. So it has this really beautiful Caribbean flavor to it. And I'm playing old time songs on that. And then there are some of the more unconventional instruments. Of course, harmonica people have seen before, but there's the rhythm bones, which are cow rib bones cut to length that I hold between my fingers and I snap them around and make clicks like a castanet. So that's one instrument. And then there's also an instrument called the quills, which are a small panpipe. So if you think of, Greek mythology, and you see the little upside down triangle shaped instrument that you blow over the top and you get all these beautiful sweet tones. I play an American version of the quills, replicating some of the sounds that have been recorded throughout time. And so it's a combination of things. There's the stories that the literal songs are saying. There are stories about the people who I might have collected the songs from. I write songs as well. And then there's the story that the instruments tell.
There you are, just sitting in your house saying, I'm going to practice today. How do you decide which one you're going to practice?
Well, these days, I tend to think about, what am I trying to do? Of course, back when I first started, everything was out there. Everything was open for being able to pick up different skills or be able to learn different songs. But nowadays, when a project comes up, I start to look at it holistically with the bird's eye view to figure out, where am I going with the project? And so I try to make sure that each of the instruments are represented in one form or another, or that they're telling a story that can really evoke cultural memory from people. Because one of the things that I found over time is that there are emotions that are evoked through time and space and cultural messages that can be told with the instruments and songs. And so that's a lot of how I spend my time. So, or if I write a song, I'll have a set of lyrics ready and I'll start thinking about what form should this set of lyrics take. Sometimes I have a preset idea about it, but other times it takes a little bit. And I've gotten in the habit of making lost records. It almost hypnotizes me into being able to write, or at least try to attain the type of writing that some of my favorite musicians have attained over the years. And so I think of lost records a lot of times.
So many people listening to this podcast and that I've encountered in the world will struggle to learn one instrument competently. As I strive to get better at playing the guitar, which is my main instrument other than singing, how do you know where to go next with your playing? How do you keep all that straight in your head? And what do you think gives you that capability?
Well, when I first started out, after I found that I had loved singing, my first instruments that I played when I was in school, I played in the auxiliary percussion pit orchestra in the band. So the concept of having multiple instruments at your disposal was something that I learned about in my very formative years. And then when I got into high school, I played marching bass drum and a 4 bass drum line. So the idea of polyphonic rhythm being broken down and learning separate parts that when played together enter a rhythmic pattern compared to, I don't know, say someone takes singing lessons and they learn melody and harmony and they learn how to blend voices. I learned how to blend rhythm very early on. So with that type of knowledge, I was drawn to people who played multiple instruments. There were people that I would eventually meet, like Mike Seeger, for example, played multiple instruments. Or I'd think of someone like, I don't know, Big Bill Broonzy, the great blues singer. He also played the fiddle. Someone like Taj Mahal, who plays just a massive variety of instruments. And so I would hear these different performers and I was inspired by that. But everything was very logical when it came to learning. So when I got the bug to play folk music, I started out playing harmonica and guitar. I loved the sound of early Bob Dylan. I remember hearing his first record. And so I got my guitar and harmonica together. And when I learned how to do that all at the same time, it wasn't something that I had to think hard about after I had already gotten the mechanics. So when it comes to doing mouth instruments and stringed instruments, that's something that became quite natural after a certain point. Granted, I've never learned to play the fiddle. That's the one instrument that I really couldn't get a grasp on how to get the bow to touch the fiddle and make a pleasing sound. And so because of that, I've given up trying to do that. But then as I went along, when I got into college, I ended up getting into New Orleans jazz. And then at the same time, I was also listening to Flatt Scruggs and Bill Monroe and the Johnson Mountain Boys and a lot of great bluegrass musicians. So I got into the sound of the banjo and I ended up getting a plectrum banjo. So a 4-string banjo with a long neck on it. And so I would join the jams and I'd be involved in that way. But then also as I went along, I got interested in jug band music. I heard Jim Queskin's jug band, and then I heard some of the older 1920s jug bands like the Memphis Jug Band and the Louisville Jug Blowers, and I then began to learn to play the jug. Nobody had taught me how to play the jug, but I started to figure out how to create a good tone with the jug, and then from there, I was able to take it to the jams, and I became quite proficient on the jug, not knowing that it was such a rare instrument that I was coming in a very unique position. And then being an African-American jug player, it'd been over 100 years since there had been a Black jug player that had taken the instrument seriously and performed it on stage. So I started to see that there was a continuity of me activating these traditional styles of music. I was creating a pathway for a gap of at least a century between the traditional players and the contemporary moment. I can remember the first time I heard Doc Watson's version of Sitting on Top of the World. That was when I first heard someone playing an open D tuning on the guitar. So once I found out that that was a thing, I started to detune my guitar and I learned how to play open D. And so that's when I started to get into country blues music. And I found that there was a whole methodology and a system to learning songs. And then there was the literature of music. I got my degree in English at Northern Arizona University. So as I got into folk music, I then found that reading and literature was something that I wanted to continue to pursue. And so I would be studying Chaucer and Shakespeare in the classroom, but then I'd be moonlighting over at the coffee houses and learning the folk songs. And then the university had a great LP collection in the library. So then I would go over there and I'd start picking up everything I could to take it as far as I might want to take all of my studies. And that led me to the Black Banjo Gathering in 2005, which eventually had me leaving Arizona and going to North Carolina, which is when I began to become a professional musician.
Okay, so many questions, but my first question is, how do you think your brain works? It's different than my brain. This is a serious question because I've really been wondering about this. Obviously, there's a natural curiosity, but there's also an approach to learning that you have.
Well, let's see. In terms of the wiring in my brain, something very early on is that I've always liked to look at the big picture of how things work. And this was true early on. I used to collect comic book cards, and I'd want to know the whole history of how the whole universe of the heroes I would read about came together. So I'd learn about their whole histories. And then when it came to more standard history as I was growing up, I wanted to know the history of the West and learn about all of the phases and all of the people and all of the legislation that led to one thing or another. And so then when I was in college, when I began to hear about the child ballads, it wasn't just listening to a couple of records, even though it was amazing to listen to like Gene Ritchie or listen to multiple versions of Barbara Allen or Seamus Innes or any number of Irish and Scottish and English ballad singers. I was then picking up the books that James Francis Child compiled of those ballads and reading all his notes about it. So my mind automatically always wants to delve as deep into a subject that I'm interested in, no matter what. One of the other things I've been very fortunate is that having grown up in the time that I have, by the time I was coming of age in the later part of the 90s, CDs were being reissued of a lot of different types of music. Some classic records from the 60s and 70s and on, which was always great for that. And they'd also take some of the mysticism around those records where you'd have expanded liner notes, you'd have bonus tracks, you would have a full explanation of what the albums meant at that time. Or sometimes if it was, say, like the Beatles anthology, they dissected the Beatles so that you didn't just hear the final product of the album, but you heard the demo, you heard the process, you heard the development of the sound. And so I was inheriting that right from the get-go instead of having to have waited the time and the decades to get to that place. And the same thing for old-time music of the 1920s and 30s. And so many times in the 20s, for example, the artist had a very specific style that you had to be recognizable on record. And so if you sit with 30 records by said artist, many times they would do a lot of the same motifs and a lot of the same stylistic ideas, to where if you sit down with it and you study it all, you could actually get a sense of where they're going to go with their style. And that's its own sort of art form in of itself, is reinterpreting old time styles from what you hear or what you've been able to collect from what's available. And then getting to meet people like Mike Seeger, who was a 1960s version of an interpreter of old time styles. I was able to get a multifaceted idea of what interpretation could mean. And then, of course, I've got my own ideas as someone born in a time after hip hop, after funk, after punk rock, and all these different things. So I'm bringing my own set of skills that are built upon quite a few different approaches to folk music and old time music. But that's a little bit of how my brain works with it. I'm a freewheeling thinker when it comes to the music, but I also try to be very studious and very informed with how I'm putting the songs together. So it's recognizable, but it's new. So that's the simple version of the answer.
How did the phrase or the idea of being the American Songster come about?
Well, as I began to get deeper into blues scholarship, I found there were these certain musicians that weren't technically blues musicians in the most straightforward sense. By the 1930s, blues, like country music, began to be codified into a single sort of style that was very recognizable. Part of it was because jukeboxes became popular. They needed something that was easy to recognize. And so you have this era in the early 20s where the styles and the approaches to the music are a bit more open-ended for the musicians because they're coming into the studios and the only criteria is that it has to sell back to the community from where they're coming from, or it needs to sell in some other community where the A&R man is trying to sell the records. And so within that, looking into blues scholarship, this phrase songster kept coming up. And back in the end of the 19th century, a songster was like a secular hymnal. It was like a book of lyrics for songs. And it was generally understood that you would know the melody because it would be a well-known song in one form or another. And then you just had the lyrics so that you could sing along to it. In the world of cowboys, you have songs like that as well, where cowboy songsters would take a melody that might be known, like the one song, Tying Knots in the Devil's Tail. The guy who wrote that said, this is to the tune of Polly Wolly Doodle. So you would have Polly Wolly Doodle as your melody, and then you would just sing brand new words over it. So that's the basic idea of a songster as a book. But after a while, musicians themselves began to be known as songsters, and people referred to them as, oh, he's a good songster, or she's a great songster, because they just knew a lot of songs and they sang a lot of different types of material. And in a pre-recorded culture, those are very important people to have around. And so fast forward to when I began to read about this particular terminology, it was in kind of an anachronism. It was something that no one was using at that time. And there were a couple of blues singers, people like Mance Lipscomb or Leadbelly or Charlie Patton, who might be referred to as a songster because they were playing other things besides just blues. And sometimes in country music, they might mention a songster where someone like Uncle Dave Macon plays stuff outside of the normal fare of old time music and country music as he's more well known. And so I thought to myself, I've learned all these styles. I've picked up all these lessons. How can I define the variety of material that I've been playing? And so I realized that the American Songster would be the way to define what I was doing. Of course, I also have an album that I did around 2008 that is called American Songster. And that was the first time I used the term. But then I realized it made a great moniker so that if people may not know Don Flemons as an individual name, the American Songster was something that could be very identifiable.
You have a radio show as well. Tell us about that.
Well, my connection into Nashville goes back to 2008. In my old group, Carolina Chocolate Drops, we played at Merle Fest, and I was approached by a great old-time country singer, George Hamilton IV, and he invited the group to perform on the Grand Ole Opry. And so when we performed there in 2008, we were the first all-black string band to ever perform on the Grand Ole Opry in its whole history. And so that's when I started performing on the Opry. Now, fast forward to 16 or so, I began to start performing on the Opry strictly on my own. And in doing that, I realized that I wanted to bring my radio show to WSM. A few years before, I began to develop this idea of American Songster Radio on WUNC in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And the idea was to interact in conversations with friends of mine, a lot of them well-known musicians, and to get into conversations that break out of the normal bounds of a typical interview. One of our guests was Steve Martin, the famous comedian and banjo player. And I decided for the interview, we would just talk about his whole career as a banjoist. It's not always clear to everybody that Steve Martin has always had a banjo. So a lot of times people say, oh, Steve Martin, he can really play? And it's like, well, yes, he started out at Disneyland doing magic tricks and playing banjo. And then that was part of his stand-up career for people who don't know his records from the early days. And so I just went into a whole conversation talking about that. And that was the premise around American Songster Radio. So bringing it out to WSM, of course, being one of the really famous country music radio stations in the home of the Grand Ole Opry, I couldn't help but continue to expand that idea. And then after a certain point, my wife, Ania, joined in with me. And now we co-host the program together.
And that WSM, you can get online.
That's right. But if people don't catch it live, they can get it in podcast form on all the major streaming platforms.
Now, the reason we connected is because you're going to be coming to Gray Fox.
Yes.
July 2026. And I'm excited to see you there as well. You will be playing there with the Traveling Wildfires. Tell us about that band formation.
Well, I've been playing out as a soloist for, it's getting toward 10 years now. I've had a little bit of playing with other musicians here and there, but I decided last year, along with my wife, Ania, we decided to truly launch a new group. And it dawned on us that we needed to really launch a Black bluegrass group. I've been doing a lot of work talking about the history of bluegrass music and African-American contributions to the well of music that has informed bluegrass over time. And when I was there, I also sang a song that I wrote called Schultz's Dream, and that was to induct a fellow by the name of Arnold Schultz into the Hall of Fame. He was the very first African-American man ever inducted into the Bluegrass Hall of Fame. And he's this interesting mystery character. So he was an itinerant musician, traveled between Kentucky and New Orleans. And while he was in Kentucky, he brought all these new harmonic ideas of passing chords and fancy chord changes into Kentucky. And it helped influence the way people were doing string band music and how they were approaching solos and playing the scales of the music and everything like that. And in the course of playing as either a fiddler or as a guitar player, he spent a lot of time with Bill and Charlie Monroe. And so Bill Monroe referenced back to Arnold Schultz many times as someone who had given him a lot of inspiration over the years. And so he's been this sort of mystery figure because he never made any recordings or anything like that. And he had passed away very sadly when he was young. But in the course of that, I realized that over my career, I've arranged many songs that have touched upon a lot of the holistic ideas that define aspects of what Arnold Schultz was playing, or the few referenced firsthand accounts we have of what he was doing in his music. And so with the Traveling Wildfires, generally we play as either a trio or a quartet or a quintet if we get real ambitious. And we are presenting multiple styles of African-American music and different types of influences. We do country music, we do bluegrass, we're doing blues, gospel music, we're touching upon string band music, so breakdowns, as well as featuring some of the interesting instruments we've talked about before. And so they're all very talented fellows that I've worked with for many years. And just to be able to bring them together, it's a new way to be able to really light a fire on the stage after having done my album Traveling Wildfire, as we were kicking around names, we realized that the Traveling Wildfires was something that would really define what we were trying to do on stage, which is really kick it up, make some beautiful music, and get a couple of smiles out there.
How did you connect with the specific members of the band?
Well, to just kind of give a breakdown of the membership, the member I've worked with the longest is Sule Greg Wilson. I met Sule back in around 2003, and he was part of a group that I was doing very early on, right before the Carolina Chocolate Drops, called Sankofa Strings. And he is a master percussionist, and he's also an amazing 5-string banjo player. And so he'll play kind of like a makeshift drum set. He'll play washboard and bones, the calabash, and then also he'll play the 5-string banjo with us. And so that's what he's been doing. So I've been working with him now for about 25 years, just about. So he really takes up the rear on that one there. We have our other percussionist, Dante Pope. I've been working with him for about 8 or 9 years, getting toward 10 years now, straight ahead. But he plays percussion as well. He does some more snare drum. And then also he does some washboard, plays the rhythm bones. And then he's my main tenor singer that he'll sing with me, because at one point he had a stint with the Fisk Jubilee Singers when he was in college. So he brings a little bit of that gospel flavor in with us. Next up, we have B. Farrow. He plays the upright bass as well as the fiddle. So he'll switch off between one or the other. He plays a lot of old-timey music, but also he's equally interested in people like Stuff Smith and Eddie South, some of the more uptown type of jazz fiddling as well. So he brings a really unique tone to what he's doing as a fiddler. And then we have finally a younger guy, Trey Wellington, who's a really well-loved new talent out on the bluegrass scene. So he's been playing 5-string with us and a little bit of guitar. And so we have him up there, and he's just putting a little extra fire right in front with us there. And that rounds out the whole crew. And a lot of the songs that we're doing are songs that I've arranged on my albums, and they take different ideas of like string band blues, which has been touched upon, but rarely in a contemporary form, because there was an older generation that played string band music, and they played the types of music that could be classified as bluegrass in a way. But of course, the marketing at that time was very limited because, of course, society was segregated at that time. So the marketing of recordings was just as segregated as society was at that time. So many times there were string bands that could be defined as bluegrass. Bluegrass is just a name, but the music itself has the same energy. And so with the Traveling Wildfires, we're just bringing some of that energy into our performances so that people can just hear it, and they can hear that we're drinking from a similar well. Just because a lot of that older generation has passed away, there just haven't been many modern interpreters that have taken up that style of music and have really seriously pushed it into the forefront. I happen to have been very fortunate in my own trajectory that I came on at a time where there was a lot of interest that had grown for Black string band music. And there was a lot of interest because the scholarship finally had caught up to the idea that it can be celebrated and it can be treated as something that is just as worthwhile and valid as anything that's already come down the pipeline in bluegrass. So, of course, in the old group in the Carolina Chocolate Drops, we were able to carve out some ground. And then with the Traveling Wildfires, we're just going to be continuing to move forward and take it even a little bit farther than we did with the old group.
So I'm sure you're inspiring a lot of African-American musicians. Are you anticipating more African-Americans coming into the bluegrass genre and or more Black string bands? What do you see for the future?
Well, that's been interesting to see because there are more people than there were at the time. Now, you have to imagine, at least for me, when it came to banjo players, for example, most of the Black banjo players I would see would either be in New Orleans jazz bands, Caribbean bands of different sorts, or they would be blues singers that pulled out the banjo every once in a while. So you had people like Taj Mahal or Guy Davis, You might have someone like Otis Taylor. And then also historically, people like Elizabeth Cotton or Etta Baker or John Jackson or Alvin Youngblood Hart was another person that I got to hear early on. And so it was always like the other alternative piece that a musician might play. They would do some banjo, but it was very rare to see a banjo dominant Black act. So when we started out, that was something that was really opening people's minds to a broader sense of where roots music could go. And as I was alluding to earlier, the reference points to Black contributions to string band music were ancient references. Like when I was first coming into it, beside the people I was mentioning, you're looking at like Henry Ossawa Tanner's beautiful painting, The Banjo Lesson, with the old man and the boy. You might see The Old Plantation from the fellow from South Carolina, where they have the enslaved people dancing, and there are the two guys playing the drums and the banjo. But it was like 17 and 1800s era Black people, and that was what you had to work with. Or you had blackface minstrel show imagery. So there wasn't really a strong contemporary set of images to be able to work off of, let alone hip, young, new folks that were doing it. So when we came along with the Chocolate Drops, I was always very conscious, being a college graduate myself, of making sure that our whole trajectory would be documented and then put into the school curriculum, so that there would never be a moment where people would ever say, I never saw Black people playing this music. And I just made sure that that never happened ever again. So now, 20 years after that initial push, it's amazing to see more people interested. And again, most of the young people, they're just not coming with the hang up that it's not for us. Because that was really a big part of it. It's like, well, this isn't really for us. There are always going to be people that are willing to jump over the line because they want to get to the music. Like when I heard bluegrass music for the first time, I would be the one young Black person that was around in my scene in Arizona. There wasn't anybody else. But I loved bluegrass so much that I would jump in with my harmonica, and I'd be jumping in with anybody. And there's any number of people of color that could have that same story, where they just jumped over the line and said, I don't care about all the racial stuff. I'm just here to play music. But for having the Chocolate Drops there, it's been amazing to see how now in the past, I don't know, let's say 5 to 6 years, you're having more people that are championing the banjo and they're wanting to get into that sound, or because also there has been a movement of these low-toned tackhead banjos. There's also an interest that has grown as well in the African-American community through the sound of the banjo, because when you start to hear the 19th century version of the banjo with its lower, throatier tone, it hits you in a different way. And so now, instead of it being like this real abstract idea of the banjo comes from Africa, it's like now people are seeing folks that are doing it. And then with social media and YouTube, you can see the African instruments that the banjo might have derived from, or some of them that did. So it's a different perspective these days. And because of that, we are seeing more people. And then, of course, I'm seeing more younger people coming to the shows in general, and they've found inspiration. So it's been beautiful overall. I'm so glad that I was able to contribute to the bigger story.
Well, that's one thing that's needed, is that role model, that person that's willing to be the first one up there with that string band. And so tell me if this resonates for you, that it seems that now Black string bands may be starting to have their moment the way women were starting that 10, 12 years ago or 15 years ago, then, where you see a lot more women on the stages, a lot more women winning IBMA such and suches of the year, and that sort of thing. So certainly that would be a wonderful advancement in the bluegrass world.
Yeah, well, it's making its slow movement. Of course, bluegrass is interesting in a way because it's a competitive sport where It's a very demanding style of music. In many ways, it's like bebop jazz in terms of the stakes are high. And if you're really up for the task, you can become one of the musicians that gets up to the upper echelons. That's one of the reasons I wanted to put an invitation out to Trey Wellington to be a part of the Traveling Wildfires. Is he's really put great talent up there, and he's standing with everybody else and he's holding his own. But that does take a lot of time to be able to get to that spot compared to just playing. And for me, I can get around on an instrument, but I've always been more of the singing type in the bluegrass setting. And there's two realms that you have to step into in bluegrass. You're either the songster that's singing all the songs, or you're one of the musicianers, which is the other anachronistic term. And a musicianer is the one that's a really great instrumentalist that may not be a singer, but they're a great instrumentalist. And bluegrass incorporates both of those aspects into play. And now that we're all sort of our own independent floating entities, because the other thing that is, it's in play, but it still needs to develop more, is that there are programs such as like a wonderful lady, Annie Beach. She runs a program called Jam Pack, and their goal is to expand diversity within the bluegrass community. And they have some students from that program that are really now coming of age, and they're sounding really fantastic. And so with that, with each year, we're going to probably see more diversity, and there's going to be more expansion of the story. That was one of the things that I saw with the Chocolate Drops, was that we would just be a presence that would be out there, so that eventually people might be turned on to the music and then pursue it in their own type of way. And so we're still seeing it grow. So I'm excited all the time. And then for me, I'm like, I don't know, I try to be like a Johnny Appleseed with recordings. So whenever I meet anybody, I'm gladly sharing old time recordings so that hopefully they might hear something in their ear that will inspire them to do something great.
Thank you for the efforts on our behalf. Okay, and one other honor that you have been bestowed is you are in the American Banjo Hall of Fame.
That was pretty wild. I will say it was a beautiful call. I've known the folks at the museum since, I don't know, maybe 2008 or 9. I remember when I was still living in North Carolina, I was driving back to Phoenix, and that was when I first became aware of the museum. And I just came in and visited. And I've just kept up with them over the years. And they gave me a call last year and they just said, we want to induct you into the Hall of Fame. I got inducted into the category under promotion as someone who has advocated for the banjo in all of its different forms. And so it's been a real honor to have been given that accolade. And when looking at the roster, I'm the 4th African-American banjo player in the Hall of Fame. And I'm the first one that's dedicated to roots music, because it's actually started out as the tenor banjo jazz banjo Hall of Fame. And so the first 3 players were all jazz banjo players. And so I'm the first one that's been inducted that's a roots music banjoist. And then I always like to mention that on my mother's side, who's Mexican-American, I'm the very first Mexican-American banjo player to be in the Hall of Fame also as well. So I take it as a great honor and a great privilege to have been brought into the Hall of Fame and to continue to advocate for the beautiful sound of the banjo.
That's beautiful. I have to admit, I didn't even know that there was an American Banjo Museum or Hall of Fame. So glad to have been educated on that. I'm sure it's a fabulous place, and that's some more good work that people are doing out there.
Oh, yeah. There's several hundred banjos in there. So they have everything from some of the oldest banjos from the 19th century up to the most modern banjos. They have one of Pete Seeger's banjos, one of Earl Scruggs' banjos. One of the curators over there is actually the banjo player for whenever you see Kermit the Frog playing the banjo, he's Kermit's banjo player. And so they have a banjo that Kermit played. Steve Martin has a banjo over there. Sonny Osborne, Ola Belle Reed's banjo is over there. It's quite an impressive display. The peak era for jazz banjo was also the peak era for the artistry of luthier work on banjos. So you have banjos that are so ornate in their design. One of my favorites is one that's shaped like an entire carousel with a carousel horse going all the way up the neck on it. And it's so elaborately designed and carved. It's really a treat just for that. It's its own art museum, even though it's also a banjo musical museum. It is its own art museum in of itself.
Worth a visit. We will put a link to it in the program notes for sure.
Great.
Well, thank you so much for this incredible conversation. I'm sure we could talk a lot more about a lot more things, but this has been really wonderful. Do you have a website that people can go to see your tour schedule and learn more about your work?
Yep, that would be theamericansongster.com. And then, of course, the Traveling Wildfires is thetravelingwildfires.com. So they can go to each one. Then also, I'm on all the social media platforms at Don Flemons and at the Traveling Wildfires. So you can find me on all those things. And yeah, we're just expanding on the Traveling Wildfires. And it's been amazing that there's been so much interest in the group so far. And then I'm still performing out solo. So I'm still showing all those instruments off, playing the old time styles. And then there's a special program I'm also doing where I am playing a score to a silent film, The Browns Buckaroo. And so showing a little bit of the Black Cowboys music that I put together years ago on my album, Black Cowboys.
A full life, full musical life. Well, thanks again. And we look forward to seeing you playing.
Awesome. Well, that sounds good. Thank you so much again, Liz.
Thank you so much for listening. Again, my name is Liz Wolfe. Please subscribe to our podcast and follow us on our social media so you never miss an episode. You can find us online at bluegrassbrooklyn.com. Brooklyn is spelled BKLYN. See you around the jam circle.